Topkapı Palace, Constantinople, March 15, 1536. 3 men walk a corridor, no swords, no torches, no armor. One carries a bowstring looped around his left fist. Their names are in a ledger. They were paid this week. The man behind that door commanded armies. He negotiated with the Pope. He ran an empire of 30 million souls. His wine cup is still warm. The 3 men do not knock. Ibrahim Pasha, Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, has approximately 8 minutes left to live. This is not a murder. This is a procedure. The Ottoman Empire, at its absolute peak, controlled 15 million square kilometers. It stretched from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf. It ran on 3 things: law, tax, and blood, in that order. And inside its most guarded walls, inside Topkapı's innermost courtyard, behind layers of gates that foreign ambassadors were never permitted to pass, there existed a corps of palace servants that no European diplomat ever fully understood. They were called the Dilsizler, the tongueless ones, deaf mutes, recruited specifically because of their condition, trained inside the palace from boyhood, ranked by seniority, salaried on the imperial payroll, not soldiers, not torturers, palace staff. They served tea. They carried sealed messages. They stood guard outside the Sultan's private council chambers. And when a vizier, a prince, or a fallen favorite needed to disappear, no trial, no witnesses, no protest entering any record, the Dilsizler were the instrument the empire reached for. 3 men, a bowstring, a corridor. If you want to understand how the most powerful government on earth turned killing into paperwork, stay with this. Subscribe now, because the answer is stranger and colder than anything you've been told. Ibrahim Pasha knew the Dilsizler existed. He had used them. He had authorized their deployment against his own rivals. He had sat in the rooms where their orders were signed and watched other men's names get crossed from the register. On the night of March 14th, he sat at Suleiman's table. He ate the Sultan's food. He drank the Sultan's wine. And at some point during that dinner, historians debate exactly when he understood, not suspected, understood. That tonight, the system was pointed at him. He said nothing that would be recorded. There was nothing to say. The bowstrings were already moving through the corridor. Here is the question that drives everything that follows. It is not why Suleiman wanted Ibrahim dead. Power is brutal, favorites fall. That story is as old as thrones. The real question, the one that should keep you up at night, is this: why deaf men specifically? Why build an entire corps around men who cannot hear? What was the Ottoman Empire so afraid of that it engineered a class of killers physically incapable of becoming witnesses? The answer is not cruelty. It is not superstition. It is not the madness of a tyrant. The answer is a legal document written in 1478. And once you read it, the bowstring stops being a weapon. It becomes a policy instrument. That is the moment this story stops being history and starts being something else entirely. The document is called the Canon Name of Maimed II, written in 1478. It is the founding legal charter of Ottoman imperial governance, the code that told the empire how to function, how to tax, how to punish, how to survive. It reads, for the most part, like a property deed, dry, administrative, precise, and buried inside its clauses with the same emotional temperature as a grain inventory is a formal legal license for fratricide. Maime's law stated it plainly. A new sultan was not merely permitted to execute his brothers upon accession. He was expected to. The preceding century of Ottoman history had been a slaughterhouse of succession wars, brother against brother, province against province, the empire fracturing and nearly dying 3 separate times. Maime's solution was to encode the killing, strip it of moral weight, make it procedure. But procedure requires instruments, and here is the mechanism that changed everything. Ottoman courts ran on testimony. A free Muslim man's sworn oath carried legal force. It could convict, it could acquit, it could critically become a record. A Dilsiz, a deaf mute, could not swear a verbal oath in the accepted form, could not testify. Under classical Ottoman legal doctrine, their witness simply did not exist inside the courtroom, not because they were considered lesser, because the law required words spoken aloud and they could not produce them. The empire had not gone looking for killers. It had found a loophole, then it built a corps around it. Dilsizler never appeared in palace records as executioners. They appeared as servants. Their salaries ran through the household budget, the same ledger as cooks, gardeners, laundry staff. The bowstrings in their belts appear in no official inventory, ever. The canon name covered royal princes, but by the 16th century, the bowstrings were being used on Grand Viziers, admirals, senior commanders. Someone expanded the mandate well beyond its original scope. And every expansion was somewhere in the ledgers. Topkapı Palace archives hold administrative registers spanning 4 centuries. Researchers working through the 16th century household budget records found the Dilsizler listed not as a special allocation, not as a crisis measure, but as a permanent standing line item. Junior Dilsizler earned less. Senior ones earned more. Individual bonuses were recorded. Deaths from old age were noted. Replacements were sourced. This was not improvised. This was a department with a budget cycle. Recruitment ran through the Devshirme, the same imperial pipeline that produced janissary soldiers and palace administrators. Provincial officials across the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Caucasus were instructed to identify deaf-mute boys of strong build and sound health. These boys entered Topkapı as children. They learned to read lips. They learned a distinct Ottoman court sign language used nowhere outside the palace walls. They learned, eventually, to kill, bowstring, leather cord, or bare hands silently in under 4 minutes. Their entire lives, from village to corridor, were an imperial investment. Now, here is where everything you think you know about this system breaks. Every Western history of the Ottoman Empire frames the Dilsizler as evidence of Oriental despotism. The mad Sultan, the savage court, the barbaric East. That framing is a fabrication, and the Venetians built it deliberately. The Balo dispatches that first described deaf-mute executioners to European audiences were written by diplomats who needed the Ottoman court to appear irrational. The actual Ottoman records tell a different story entirely. A state more administratively sophisticated than Venice. A killing apparatus that was more rule-bound, more documented, more procedurally consistent than any European court execution of the same era. The Dilsizler were not proof of Ottoman chaos. They were proof of Ottoman order. That is the thing that should frighten you. So who ran it? The Sultan issued orders, but someone managed the core day to day. Someone wrote the salary lines. Someone sourced the replacements. Someone stood in that corridor and gave the final signal. That person had a title, and the title was, absurdly, perfectly, the chief gardener. Bowstrings, head of the palace grounds. On paper, he managed irrigation channels, fruit orchards, the flower beds along the Bosphorus shoreline. In reality, he was one of the most dangerous men alive. He commanded several thousand Bowstrings, palace gardeners who were simultaneously trained soldiers, waterborne rapid response units, and the Sultan's personal enforcement arm, operating completely outside the regular military chain. The Dilsizler were his most specialized unit. His quiet ones, his finishers. When a sultan wanted a man removed without a trial, the order moved through a precise chain. Sultan to Bowstrings, Bowstrings to senior Dilsiz to team. No written kill order was ever committed to paper at any stage. The instruction passed entirely in court sign language, between men who could not speak, in a language only they knew, inside walls no outsider could enter. The Sultan maintained separation. The Bowstrings maintained separation. The legal system received no verbal testimony because none had ever existed to receive. Think about that architecture for a moment. It is not primitive. It is not the product of rage or madness. It is a system specifically engineered so that no single surviving document could ever fully reconstruct what happened. The silence was structural. It was load-bearing. Return to Ibrahim Pasha, March 14, 1536. Suleiman had hosted him at dinner. But before the soup course was cleared, a bureaucratic authorization, not a kill order, never a kill order, had already passed to the Bowstrings. By the time Ibrahim lifted his wine cup, the sign language briefing was already complete. The bowstring was already moving. The dinner continued. 2 men sat across a table. One of them knew exactly what the other had already set in motion. Neither said a word about it. Ibrahim Pasha was not the first. He was not close to the last. He was a data point in a 4-century operational record. Venetian Republic ran the finest intelligence network in the 16th century Mediterranean. Their permanent ambassadors in Constantinople, the Bailey, filed detailed dispatches back to Venice describing Ottoman court politics with a precision that modern historians still rely on. These men had sources inside Topkapı, paid sources, carefully cultivated over years. And in the 1560s and 1570s, those sources began reporting the same pattern with increasing frequency. Senior officials summoned to the inner court. Hours of silence, then nothing, no public announcement, no body displayed at the palace gates, which was the standard Ottoman practice for sanctioned executions. No trial record filed anywhere. The official simply ceased to appear in all subsequent Ottoman correspondence, as if a clerk had drawn a single line through a name. The Venetians recognized this as execution. What they could not decode was the mechanism. Because the mechanism left no fingerprints, they knew how to read. One dispatch from 1574 describes the death of a senior palace figure in language that is, in retrospect, astonishing. The man was found dead in his chamber, the source reported by the palace gardeners, of causes that no one in the palace would name. The palace gardeners, the bowstrings. The source was describing the bowstrings men with perfect accuracy and had absolutely no idea. The dispatch was filed, archived. It sat untouched for 300 years. It was the most precise external description of an Ottoman bureaucratic removal ever written, and the man who wrote it did not understand a single word of what he had witnessed. That is how complete the silence was. Venice's best spies looked directly at the machine and saw gardeners. Venetians saw gardeners. The Grand Viziers saw something else entirely. They saw the system from the inside. They understood every component, the salary lines, the sign language chain, the bowstrings' quiet nod. They had administered it themselves, signed off on its budget, authorized its deployment against rivals who had made the same mistake of accumulating too much influence, too visibly, too fast. They understood the machine with total clarity. And then, one by one, the machine processed them. The 215 men who served as Grand Vizier between 1453 and 1839, at least 36 were executed. The majority died inside the palace. No trial, no charge filed, no body displayed. The Dilsizler served whoever currently held the Sultan's authorization, and that authorization transferred with every change in political wind. Loyalty to previous Sultan provided nothing. Loyalty to previous Grand Vizier provided nothing. Years of faithful service, military victories, administrative competence, none of it registered. The system had no memory, no sentiment. It had a budget and a chain of command, and it ran those two things with equal efficiency regardless of who was on the receiving end. Consider what that means for the men who ran it. Every Grand Vizier who signed the Dilsizler payroll knew with mathematical certainty that his predecessors had been killed by that same payroll. He signed it anyway, because the alternative, dismantling the system, exposing it, refusing to maintain it, meant something worse. It meant succession chaos, open civil war, the kind of violence that had nearly destroyed the empire before maimed II wrote his law. The Grand Viziers maintained the bowstring because they understood, coldly and correctly, that the bowstring was cheaper than the alternative. They were not naive men trapped in a system they didn't understand. They were intelligent men who understood it completely and chose maintenance over martyrdom. That is a different kind of horror, not the horror of ignorance, the horror of calculation. Kara Mustafa Pasha, Grand Vizier under Maimed IV, the man who led 150,000 soldiers to the gates of Vienna in 1683 and lost, was executed by imperial order after the defeat, not by Dilsizler inside Topkapı. He was killed in Belgrade by an imperial commissioner under a different protocol. The Dilsizler were not used on him, but his predecessor in office had been removed via bowstring. His successor would be too. Kara Mustafa had attended those funerals, had signed those budget lines, had administered those removals with his own authorization. When his own end came, the mechanism he knew most intimately was, almost ironically, not the instrument deployed. History notes this as a minor procedural detail. It should not. It is the whole story of what this system did to the people who built it. In 1839, Sultan Abdülmecid I signed the Tanzimat, a sweeping reformation of Ottoman governance built on European legal principles. Formal trials required for capital punishment, written judicial records mandatory, extrajudicial palace executions abolished by decree. On paper, the Dilsizler as an execution corps ceased to exist overnight. What happened next was quieter, and in some ways more revealing than anything the corps had done while operating. European-trained Ottoman reformers working through the Topkapı administrative registers encountered the Dilsizler salary lines, the bowstrings budget allocations, the graduated pay grades, the bonus notations. They understood immediately what they were reading. The decision made in the early 1840s was not to expose the records, not to publish them, not to file a formal historical accounting. The decision was to reclassify. The Dilsizler entries were relabeled as ceremonial court attendants. Their function was redefined in the register annotations as decorative palace presence. The salary ledgers survived. They were too embedded in the broader household accounts to remove cleanly, but the language explaining what those salaries actually purchased was stripped out, systematically, register by register. Here is the thing that should stop you cold. The reformers who dismantled the Dilsizler used the exact same institutional logic as the men who built them. Documentation is power. Controlled documentation is absolute power. The Tanzimat was supposed to represent a clean break, transparency, rule of law European modernity. And its very first act regarding the Dilsizler was to launder their records using the same bureaucratic precision the Corps had used to make their kills invisible for 4 centuries. The empire had changed its laws, it had not changed its instincts. The reclassified records held. For nearly 100 years, they held. Then a historian in the Topkapı Museum archive found a ledger the reformers had missed, and read a line that was never supposed to survive. Topkapı Palace Museum, Istanbul, sometime in the 1940s, a Turkish historian working through a stack of household administrative registers from Süleyman's reign pulls a ledger that the 1840s reclassification team had catalogued as routine domestic accounts. It was routine, mostly grain allocations, candle tallies, fabric for court robes, and then, on a page covering a 3-month period in 1536, a budget line listing 7 Dilsizler by name, monthly salary. Rank notation, unremarkable. Except beneath it, in the same hand, a secondary notation. 3 of the 7 had received a bonus payment in the 2nd month of that quarter. The phrase used was archaic, obsolete even by 19th century standards, which is precisely why the reformers had missed it. It translated, roughly, as for service rendered in the completion of palace affairs. 2nd month of that quarter was March, 1536. Ibrahim Pasha died in March 1536. 3 Dilsizler received a bonus in the month Ibrahim Pasha died. The ledger does not specify the service. It does not need to. The second most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire was worth a bonus. The register recorded that transaction with the same ink weight, the same column formatting, the same complete absence of moral register as the entry directly above it for lamp oil. Sit with that for a moment, not the killing, the accounting. This is what the system actually built, not monsters, not zealots, not men driven by hatred or ideology. Accountants, men who recorded a human life ending the same way they recorded a fuel expenditure. The bowstring was a line item. The bonus was an invoice. Ibrahim Pasha's death was a budget variance that closed cleanly at the end of the quarter. That ledger is now held in the Topkapı Palace Museum archives. The notation is still there. What does not exist anywhere in any archive, in Istanbul, in Venice, in Vienna, in any library on earth, is a trial record for Ibrahim Pasha's death, a charge sheet, a defense, a verdict, a single written word acknowledging that a legal proceeding of any kind occurred. Because none did, it was never the design that one would. The Ottoman Empire formally collapsed in 1922. The Dilsizler had been dissolved for 80 years by then, but the logic that produced them, the idea that the cleanest expression of state power is the kind that generates no recoverable legal record, did not dissolve with the empire. Every government in the 20th century that maintained undocumented removal units, that reclassified its killing as administrative procedure, that paid its executioners through budget lines rather than court orders, was working inside the same grammar maimed II had codified in 1478. The Ottoman Empire did not invent that instinct. It simply bureaucratized it earlier and more elegantly than almost anyone else. The canon name of maimed II is not a horror document. It is an efficiency document. That distinction is the most unsettling sentence in this entire story. Ibrahim Pasha died because he had become a personnel problem that the system was designed to resolve. The 3 men who resolved it were compensated appropriately. Their bonus was logged. Their names were retained in the register for auditing purposes. The empire continued. The ledger closed. The next quarter's accounts were prepared. Somewhere in Topkapı Palace tonight, in the corridor between the 3rd and 4th courts, there is no sound, no record of a scream, no record of a plea, no record of a final word spoken into the dark by a man who had spent his life serving a system that was always, eventually, going to spend him. That silence was not a byproduct. It was the deliverable. It was funded, trained, ranked, and audited for 400 years. And it worked so completely that most people alive today have never heard the word Dilsizler. The bowstring is still in the ledger. The ledger is still in the archive. The archive is open to the public. Nobody put a warning label on it. If this story stayed with you, it should subscribe now, because the Ottoman Empire was not the only dynasty that industrialized silence. The next video goes inside a European royal court that ran the same system for 2 centuries and called it household management. That story is already waiting for you.